Welcome to M Squared TechCast, a live show offering the latest news and interviews with the people driving business, technology, and politics in Michigan.
Hey, it's Matt Roush.
And Mike Brennan.
And we're back with another segment here on the M Squared TechCast. We're talking to Russell Gelvin. He is an attorney with our old pal Enrico at Traverse Legal PLC.
He is. And Russell's expertise is in software, both licensed and open source. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. We might want to start with just a primer on what is the difference between licensed and open source. That's not one of your questions here so much, but how would you define that for, we have a pretty sophisticated audience, but there still might be people out there who don't quite understand.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess just taking a step back, with open source, it's important to note that there's basically two broad categories of software that's going to be out there, and nowadays it's a little bit foggier because there's new developments, but essentially you have the software that the human is able to read and write, and it's called human readable source code.
Mm-hmm.
And then traditionally it would be compiled through a computer processor or something like that would turn it into machine readable code, which a human wouldn't be able to read. It would just be like a series of ones and zeros, and that's what the machine reads. So when we're talking about open source software, we're talking about software that is made available under a special software license that allows the licensee, the person who's getting the software, to actually access the source code, not just the binary executable that you would usually see with an application. So, for example, you install an application on your phone or on your computer, and you run the executable, and you're running the program. You're not able to make modifications to the program itself. You're not able to customize it and things like that unless you have access to the source code. So an open source software license is just a license that lets you access that source code, which is hugely important for that very reason.
Right.
Okay.
And it's surprising how many packages out there that are offered by different companies have open source in them, right? There's a lot of that.
It's not even a wild statement to say virtually everything is going to have open source in it, or at the very least, open source software was used in the development process. Quite frankly, in the development community, it would be blasphemy to attempt to develop without using some open source in some capacity, at least as like a tool. So it might not be embedded into the software you're developing, but you're probably going to use some open source tools to help you develop it in the first place.
So what would be some examples of open source software that people might be familiar with?
Oh, wow. It's all over the place. So one example, I guess, that's fairly common, 7-Zip. It's an alternative to, I guess, like WinZip or other programs that you would use to compress your own files. And yep. 7-Zip is completely open source, so you can just go download it. It's under, I believe, the GPL open source license. And you can download it, you can use 7-Zip, but furthermore, you can go into the source code and modify it, customize it to your own features, or even take the 7-Zip, the source code, and put it into your own software. Now, there are caveats, there are catches. If you use an open source license, it's not just you can do whatever you want. They're providing you their software for free, but they also want you to make them certain promises, and we'll talk about that when we get to the risk associated with open source.
Well, good segue. Why don't we go right into that?
Yeah, let's talk about benefits and risks.
So let's start with benefits. So, like I said, nowadays it's not even so much a benefit; it's a necessity. You can't. It wouldn't make sense to do software development without open source. First of all, you're just reinventing the wheel. You're wasting money. So, for a large commercial enterprise, you want to save every dollar you can. Why would you have your programmers go rewrite functionality or software feature that is already out there, everybody's using it, there's a standard, and it's
proven, debugged, everything else, right?
So open source is huge. Mm-hmm. And that's another one of the very advantages of open source is that ability for a large community to debug it. So it's not just one developer behind closed walls doing it. It's a whole community, everybody testing it, and that just gives you so many more opportunities to catch bugs, make mistakes, improvements, and you have a community of people that are contributing back to it. So open source has just been an absolute phenomena for the last couple of decades now, and it is at the heart of all of software development. Even your major commercial enterprises, Apple, Google, Microsoft, they're all in the open source game. Everybody's involved.
Mm-hmm. And the downside?
So the downside obviously it's a software license, right? So it's essentially forming a binding legal contract between the licensor and the licensee. The licensor is the person the author, owner of the software who is giving it to you, and the licensee is the person who's receiving the software and using it. Now, there are all varieties, different shapes and kinds of open source licenses, and they all involve their own risk. Some are very low risk. So the most common example would be the MIT open source license. And basically, there's only one real requirement for the MIT license. You have to reproduce that license notice and the copyright notice for the author. So it's basically saying you gotta give a shout out to the author. You know, he's letting you use the software for free. Just acknowledge him. And crazy enough, there have been lawsuits over similar licenses. I haven't seen one on the MIT license, but the artistic license is similarly considered a low risk open source license. And there's a famous federal court decision where the court basically said just simply deleting that license, that copyright notice and that license, that's a breach of contract, and now you are potentially liable for damages for breach of contract and damages for copyright infringement, depending on the jurisdiction you're in.
That could be expensive, eh?
That can be insanely. It could undermine it could bankrupt your business, quite frankly, because if your product if your entire product is based on copyright infringement, you're done. You're done, and that's considered a low risk open source license. But the reason it's considered low risk is because it's not that hard. Just don't delete the copyright notice. You know, give credit where credit is due. So it's not hard to comply with, but if you're completely ignoring it, or if you're, being brazen and just deleting copyright notices and things like that, you can get in big trouble that can really cost you some money.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about the differences between open source and free software, because I know you said part of what you do as a hobby is game development, and I know there's software out there called Unity that is the base version of it for game developers is free, but then they try to upsell you. But so what's the difference between free and open source?
I'm glad that you mentioned Unity, because that's my baby. That's I do all of my personal software development in Unity, C#, so I love it. Unity, that's a completely different animal. It's actually it's free in a sense. So basically, they'll let you use the non-professional version, the free version, unless your company makes over $100,000 in revenue, and then you're required to purchase a license for the commercial version. Okay. What I would call that, that's not necessarily a freemium license, but you can license your software any way you want. There's as creative as you can be. That's how many different software licensing models there are out there nowadays. So traditionally back in the very beginning of software development, most software was actually considered open source, and people weren't really thinking about software licensing, software copyrights. I've seen in documentaries that it was really Bill Gates that kind of pioneered the idea of, hey, I got a copyright in this software, I can go charge people licenses and monetize it. And that was the whole advent of proprietary software. So it's kind of funny that in the beginning, it was all open source, and then it kind of went to proprietary because that's where people were making serious money, and now it's come full circle, and now open source has really made a resurgence, a renaissance. But yeah, the difference between free software, I gotta clarify though, open source does not mean free.
Yeah.
Now they use the term freedom, software freedom, but software freedom doesn't mean free as in free beer. It means free as in, think of like free speech. When I say so with open source, it's all about software freedom, but it's kind of like an almost like a hippie kind of concept of freedom, man. You got to fight the man. And the whole idea is I want to know what's in the software I'm using. I want to be able to control. I don't want you to be able to sneak stuff in and trick me. I want you I want to be able to get inside and I want to have the freedom to do what I want. I don't want to be dependent on you. So quite frankly, with all the open source licenses I'm aware of, there's nothing in it that says you can't charge a fee. And I'm actually involved in litigation right now. We've got some pending cases that's a major issue. And I think that just looking at the open source community, the discussions of the people who actually drafted these open source licenses, there's no doubt that software freedom does not mean free as in free beer. It means free as in free speech.
Okay.
Without naming names, let's talk about some of your litigation. We'll give you just broad brushstrokes of what the issues are, what's going on.
I previously mentioned the MIT open source license, which we consider to be a fairly low risk license. The only requirement is, don't delete the copyright notice. But there's all different varieties of open source licenses. So you can move let's call that the low risk category, where it should, not a whole huge burden. It's not hard to comply with. And then you can move into more medium risk licenses like the Apache license, the MPL license. But the real high risk licenses are known as copyleft, which it's this play on
Copyright, copyleft.
Yeah, it's a play on copyright law,
Yeah,
exactly.
right,
And it's intended to be the exact opposite of copyright law. So where copyright gives you a sort of monopoly over your own works of authorship, the things you make, you get a monopoly over it, right? Because that incentivizes you to be creative. That's why, and it's a huge part of like the whole American legal system.
Right.
Copyleft, the whole idea is I don't get to exercise a monopoly. I'm giving up my rights. So the most famous is the GPL, the GNU General Public License. GNU is just the organization that sort of I think they were involved in the original creation of the Linux kernel. I'm not sure, but they're involved in that in some capacity there. There was also Linus Torvald. I'm not sure where the division of labor was. But so it was all originally created, I believe, for the Linux kernel operating system. And the whole idea behind copyleft is if you take my software and modify it and create something new out of it, if you create a derivative work under copyright law, you now have to make that derivative work GPL as well. They call this the viral clause. And I previously worked in a commercial, enterprise setting, and that's the big risk. That's a scary risk from any company that's producing software products or even physical products that contain software. Because what that says is if you've created a derivative work out of my work, and it's a pretty liberal definition of what's going to be a derivative work. Pretty much any reuse of a copyrighted work that isn't fair use or isn't, de minimis, if it's copyrightable, and if what you're doing is copyright infringement, it's probably going to be a derivative work. Now I have to relicense my software under the GPL license. What that means is I have to give everybody I'm giving my software to the source code. So if I'm trying to protect my source code, that's a disaster. That's worse than copyright infringement.
Right.
If you got an injunctive order from a court saying you now have to go release your source code, that could undermine your entire business. We've seen some. We've seen some major companies that have been having issues with complying with the GPL. The litigation I'm involved in is with the GPL, which is, a very complex license. There's a lot of, people try to make it sound ambiguous and difficult to interpret. I personally think it's very straightforward, and I think it's very clear what the intent of the license is. If I'm using your software and making something new out of it, I got to make my software GPL. I got to provide everybody I give it to access to the source code. And they have to get the same rights and freedoms I got. So they now are allowed to go redistribute it. Now, so obviously from a proprietary software perspective, that's a disaster. That really limits your ability to monetize your software, and you're exposed, because if you mess up, you can get sued, and like I said, copyright infringement, breach of contract, and now with the GPL, we're also talking about the prospect of an injunctive order, where we're not just talking about money, we're talking about you have to go release your source code, you have to go release your trade secrets, things like that.
Wow. Why would somebody want to do that then? What's the advantage of something like that?
Well, so like I said, it's kind of like a hippie thing, right? It's software freedom. So the people who first started, the famous guy behind the GPL is this guy, Richard Stallman. I think he's a professor at MIT. And it's his belief that all software should be free. You should be able to get the software. And it's like a viral. It's almost like a trap that if you accidentally put GPL in your software, it now becomes GPL.
Wow, that's amazing.
So tell us a little bit about your background, how you happened to wind up working with Enrico Schaefer at Traverse Legal.
Yeah, sure. So originally, I was a philosophy major in college, and that got me really into symbolic logic.
That is one of the pathways to law school, philosophy, as along with political science. Yeah, right. Yeah.
So that kind of got me into the hardcore symbolic logic, and then kind of leading up to law school, I started dabbling in programming video games just sort of as a hobby, and I realized that programming is just pure symbolic logic. So I fell in love with it, and it just completely took off, and it's been a huge passion of mine ever since. So I've got 5-6 years of really solid experience programming video games in Unity, C#. So when I finished law school, I really wanted to get into something to do with software law, intellectual property, especially. I love copyright law, working on some academic papers in the copyright software space. But it's kind of a new space still, especially like when I was coming out, I was talking to my career advisors, and they didn't really know what to tell me to get into it. And then I randomly got contacted by a recruiter on Facebook that Ford Motor Company was specifically looking for an attorney with a background in programming, because it's blown up. To understand these complex issues, especially in open source, you have to have 1 foot in the software world and 1 foot in the copyright law, in the legal world. You have to understand the copyright issues, but then we haven't gotten into the weeds, but like open source software gets really detailed from a technical perspective. And it's like to even address the legal issues, you have to understand really complex software technical issues. So I was brought into Ford Motor Company, kind of, cut my teeth working in-house there, doing open source software licensing review, working with teams, risk assessments, working with executives, got into software licensing, general copyright issues, just anything the business needed. And it was, coming right out of law school, it was the best experience you could possibly ask for. Like, it's kind of unheard of to have that sort of opportunity.
Wow.
So how'd you wind up with your current employer?
And then I just, Enrico posted a job ad, and I just applied. I really wanted to get into litigation at that point because I saw these issues brewing. Like, the open source is just so rife for litigation. Everybody's using it, and nobody really understands it. Like, it's difficult because you have to be a lawyer and you have to be a programmer to really understand it. So he reached out to me and he's like, hey, we've got some stuff going on. I know you're really interested in litigation. You love copyright law. You love software law. Why don't you come check it out? And we've just been killing it ever since.
Okay.
Okay, so I was looking at Dave there trying to get the signal. So what, do you got a minute or two left? Okay.
All right. So this is where you get to give your shameless plug.
Yep.
So this is your shameless plug. So
Right.
if people want more information about you and the services you provide, where do they go? How do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, definitely, like I said, there are a lot of benefits, but there are also a lot of risk associated with open source software. Traverse Legal is certainly here to help you with your needs. We offer services that you normally wouldn't expect from a law firm. For example, we have internal software tools that we'll use to scan your source code, identify all the open source licenses, all the copyright notices, and we'll really help you get squared away, make sure you're compliant with all those open source licenses. If you got any issues, we'll sit there and we'll work through them with you. It might involve removing some high-risk licenses. I'm a programmer. I can go through your code with you. We'll get you squared away. You can just visit us at traverselegal.com, submit a request, just give us some information about what you're looking for, and I'll reach out to you and help you get squared away.
Traditional four-year students love Lawrence Technological University's thriving campus life, but LTU has always met non-traditional students' needs too. Lawrence Tech offers over 100 degree and certificate programs that can get adult students started or back on track. And most of our classes are conveniently offered evenings at our beautiful Southfield campus or online, so you can balance your social, family, and work life even while you power up your career. Lawrence Tech, where Blue Devils dare.